Byron Good reported that American pain narratives are distinctive among cross-cultural illness narratives in that they seem inevitably to derive from the contradictions of mind-body dualisms. This Cartesian flavour also seemed to underlie the problematic embodiedness experienced by many of our own respondents who tended to talk about themselves as essentially Cartesian minds in charge of bodies that are subordinate and subject to mental control. However, while selves may be perceived in terms of mind-body dualisms, they are experienced as embodied. And this embodiedness features subjective, experiential and existential qualities of intactness or integrity. Eric Cassell has previously argued that suffering occurs when a person perceives impending destruction and continues until either the threat of disintegration has passed or until the person's integrity can be restored in some other manner. When integrity is breached or continuously threatened in the case of chronic illness, the problematic of embodiedness asserts itself. Do I admit the illness, disability or pain into myself? Does this challenge my embodiedness, my sense of intactness or integrity? How do I reconcile, for example, me and my neck? One key characteristic of embodiedness is the habituated nature of bodily praxis. Respondents reported taking their bodies for granted prior to developing OOS symptoms, often with a sense of wistfulness. In most cases, it was a previously unproblematic habituated bodily praxis that had contributed to their OOS injuries. For example, several respondents viewed their habitual posture and ability to concentrate intensely for long periods while shutting out bodily sensations and physical discomfort as factors that made them vulnerable to OOS injuries. Rehabilitation involved learning to rehabituate bodily praxis through ergonomic techniques and bodywork such as yoga and Pilates, while exercising constant surveillance over their bodies. Respondents carry this heightened body awareness into their daily embodied lives and routines, learning to pace themselves, modify the way they performed work, domestic and leisure tasks. One respondent, for example, had herself videotaped playing the piano so she could have her positioning analysed by an ergonomic expert so she could learn anew how to use her body at the piano. Rehabilitation had been successful for only a few of our respondents. As long as they continued to surveil their bodies for signs indicating they were exceeding their functional limitations, they managed to minimise the problematic of embodiedness associated with their chronic OOS condition and to maintain some sense of integrity. The fragility of this was revealed in apparently contradictory statements within individual narratives claiming complete recovery on the one hand, yet also articulating continuing subjection to functional impairment and being careful never to demand too much from their bodies. I quote, "I find it hard to see myself as a well person. I was reasonably sporty and active when I came to university, and on that time I put on bucket loads of weight because you can't exercise with OOS. But yeah, I think what I wanted to be and what I am are different. So I guess now I'm just trying to work out how not to have a disability anymore." And she laughs. "It's pretty weird. It sounds weird." Unquote. Just as personal integrity or intactness is necessarily embodied, so too is liminality. The notion of liminality pervades the literature on chronic pain and chronic fatigue syndrome and other medically indeterminate conditions in two primary treatments. One draws on Turner's liminality as betwixt and between, while the other draws on Douglas's matter out of place. In the first instance, sufferers of chronic conditions that defy medical diagnosis often describe aspects of social and medical liminality while awaiting or seeking diagnosis. A failure to procure a diagnosis only heightens sufferers' sense of liminality. Liminality is often accompanied by a sense of isolation and detachment, being put on hold and feeling worthless. In the second instance, chronic indeterminate conditions as phenomena that cannot be readily assigned to accepted normative medical and social classifications represent social disorder. Jean Jackson suggests that chronic pain sufferers threaten the logic of the medical classification system by straddling the mind-body boundary and, as such, embody disorder. Many of our respondents similarly describe their experiences of OOS in ways that evoke the notion of liminality. Some describe the period while they waited for referrals to various medical specialists, decisions from ACC on whether or not their claims were accepted, as a disconnected period that has similarities with the idea of falling out of culture used by Ewan and associates to describe the experiences of their Australian respondents. One man described being stuck in limbo while waiting for a second opinion from yet another specialist whilst being off work. Another described losing her sense of purpose and feeling adrift when she was put off work. In the following quotation, a respondent recalled how she withdrew from her social life, and I quote, It was just unbelievably awful. It was so isolating. I had one friend who had these beautiful Parker Knoll chairs. They had lovely arms. I could sit there and put my arm on the arm of the chair and visit with him and have a conversation. But the rest of the time it was hard, and I lost all the habits of going out and going to a movie or just being social during that time. I watched a lot of television because that was something I could do. Not because I wanted to necessarily, but that became my hobby because everything else just dwindled away, everything else hurt, everything else made it worse or was impossible, unquote. Another aspect of liminality can be found in the problematic that chronic conditions pose for the classic sick role. The sick role represents a socially legitimate but temporary classification for those who threaten normative social classifications and roles with the deviance of short-term illness. However, because people with chronic conditions fail to comply with the time-limited exemptions of the sick role, they remain in a liminal status without the legitimation afforded by the sick role, declassified but not yet reclassified. In accordance with reports of sufferers of chronic fatigue and chronic pain syndrome, our respondents described moving towards social declassification as a result of their OOS injuries and consequent inability to participate in the workplace, to fulfil obligations and expectations associated with social roles, and general withdrawal from society. While successful rehabilitation could lead to social reclassification as a worker, the liminality associated with the social isolation and symptoms of pain and functional disability that accompanied their experiences as OOS sufferers was always, quite literally, within touch. Recovered or renegotiated identities retained this liminal fragility, so that, as noted above, respondents became exquisitely self-absorbed, exercising constant bodily surveillance and discipline. I quote, "I'm always close to it, you know. There's veering towards it. You can never live a normal life because you're always aware of this problem," unquote. In conclusion, sufferers of OOS strove to make sense of events around breakdown and diagnosis and the process of rehabilitation and recovery. Biographies were certainly disrupted, but also rewritten and reframed, old selves and identities grieved for, and new selves and identities negotiated. Like suffering, biographical disruption can be viewed as an effective injury to a person's integrity. Integrity in the sense used here of intactness is necessarily embodied. Similarly, the attempt to repair or restore integrity through reworking biographies and negotiating new identities is not a disembodied process, but is mediated through broken bodies and highly problematic embodiments. The disruption to respondents' lives constituted a liminal phase. However, this liminality was not a simple betwixt and between one social state and another, nor a precisely demarcated interval spanning declassification and reclassification. Rather, aspects of the liminal phase were projected into sufferers' past biographies, incorporating elements of predispositions to OOS in the form of employment circumstances and work tasks, being a certain type of worker, or having certain physical attributes, or a certain personality type. Aspects of the liminal phase, such as emotional, psychological, and physical or bodily fragility, were also carried into recovered or renegotiated identities, selves, and biographies that remain perpetually on the threshold of physical breakdown. The liminalities that OOS sufferers described, where they felt isolated and disconnected, were desolate spaces of breached integrity, where sufferers struggled with their relationships with their broken bodies, where they held on to previous identities, resisted disability and labelling, where they yearned for successful rehabilitation and recovery. Rehabilitation never fully healed integrity or restored intactness. Rather, the repairs consisted of makeshift patches that constantly promised to tear. Thank you.